This is the In Tune interview, back again to talk to composers about the music they compose. It's me, Steven again, and Brian seems to have gotten lost along the way again. Rumor has it he wandered into a haunted house. I'll go find him later. But for now, we're going to talk to our newest guest, Rebecca Tripp. So, hey, Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Hey, Steven.
We're very happy to have you here. And as we were talking about just before we started recording, actually, I just stumbled upon her music on Twitter. And I wandered into this forest of medleys from Final Fantasy and Legend of Zelda. It was pretty neat. So, but I'll stop doing the talking. And Rebecca, why don't you kind of give the listeners a little bit of an idea of who you are and what kind of music you create?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm an avid gamer, although I do tend to prefer games with a lot more fantasy, a lot more story. And I think I appeal more to fans who like that kind of thing too. Music is definitely my main passion, and I think video games are the reason for this.
Oh, okay.
And ever since I played Final Fantasy IV, I knew I wanted to be a composer. Just something,
yeah.
The soundtrack just captivated me, and I had this need inside of me to encapsulate those feelings and give them to other people. So I started with original music, which I still do. I've done a lot more originals than medleys and covers and that kind of thing, but the covers are more fun for me. And the reason is I like to take all these feelings I had from video games and sort of show different facets or aspects of them so that people can kind of relive the nostalgia of things like Final Fantasy, Zelda, Chrono Trigger, Metroid, stuff like that, as though it's for the first time again. That's one of the major things I do.
That is really awesome. It's interesting that you say that as well, because, and we'll talk more about the song that you brought later, but it is a medley from Final Fantasy VI. Mm-hmm. And I recently have actually discovered what a good soundtrack that is. I didn't play the Final Fantasy games.
Oh, really? I assumed you had.
Well, most people have, right? And so I tried them, but I never got into them.
Okay.
But I know so many people who love the music. So I'm like, that does it. If I don't have time to play these 40, 50, 60, 70-hour RPGs, then I'm just going to listen to the soundtracks. So I started with the first one, and I listened to it like 8 times. Mm-hmm. And I kept doing that until I got to 6. And I have listened to that for hours and hours over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, I did blame you. It might actually be Uematsu's best, or if not his best, one of them for sure. Top tier.
It's my favorite so far. Mm-hmm. I'm very inexperienced, but it is my favorite. But all that to say, it was really fun listening to your medley, because I'm so used to hearing the songs play one after the other, like going through the whole story of the game, mm-hmm. that it felt very familiar to me. But I was like, oh, wow, I've never, this is exactly what I imagined would, it would sound like when you were to bring this particular instrument in here, or you could hear the strings so much better than on the SNES in this section. So, but anyway, that was my moment. It was pretty cool.
There was some of that in the creation process. There were parts I wanted to emphasize, and then there were also parts I wanted to make more subtle and bring out more of the harmonies or background instruments. Just, again, like I said, show a different facet of the song. For example, some music in the series might have a really prominent bass line, but it's still not something people tend to focus on. I might have a small section in a movement that focuses on that bass line to show people exactly what they were missing if they weren't tuning into it.
Right. No, I've been listening to it so obsessively that I thought I had caught all these things, but apparently not. Mm-hmm. And so, as we've already alluded to, it's a medley of a bunch of Final Fantasy VI songs. How many are in that medley again?
Ooh, I can't remember the exact number. I think it's around 20.
Yeah, and the whole thing is 22 minutes long.
Yeah.
So, this is obviously going to be one of those times when we're not going to play the whole song, but we'll give you a nice taste of it here in a minute.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's I put so much of my heart and soul into those medleys, almost more than I could possibly convey, because of the amount that those games affected me in my childhood. It was that they made me who I am, and I think a lot of FF fans, especially FF6 fans, would agree with me if they're listening to this.
That's really awesome. music is built of emotion, and I love hearing stories about people who connected with it and then came back later to kind of share that connection with other people.
Yeah.
I guess that said, this would be a good time to take a little break and play through some of the Final Fantasy VI Epic Orchestral Medley.
Awesome.
that was Rebecca Tripp's epic orchestral medley. Sorry, I almost said melody. Medley from Final Fantasy VI. Obviously, not the whole thing.
Yeah.
Couldn't put the whole 22 minutes in there.
Yeah.
But I hope you enjoyed what you heard. So one of my first questions for you actually is this the style that you usually use, this kind of big, open, complex orchestral style, or is this kind of a rarity for you?
I would say it's lately what I use about 50% of the time. When I started doing remixes or arrangements is really the correct term for what I'm doing. I was doing orchestral stuff right off the bat, but I did a lot of things in a more sort of Celtic, folk, or New Age kind of genre, and I started combining them. You've probably noticed listening to my work, a lot of my work is more sort of soothing and gentle. It's the kind of thing that is meant to really calm down and uplift at the same time. The orchestral medleys, I try and take people sort of on a tour of a bunch of different things, feelings, stories, etc. Like I try and tell a full story that makes the person feel satisfied, like they've gone through the game again, only with fresh eyes.
How did that come about? What's your history with Final Fantasy?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I started playing it on an emulator because I never had never had the games when they came out. But I started with 4 and 6 pretty much at the same time, and I remember, like, I was obsessed with Zelda back then. That didn't change, actually.
Yeah.
I'd never found another game that even came close to the way that made me feel, or really was very satisfying. I mean, I loved Donkey Kong Country. That was really high on my list. Loved Metroid. Mario was fun and whatnot. But when I found Final Fantasy, it was like, this is me. This is who I am. That's the only way I could describe it. There was something in there that I had been looking for. And I also found it at a time in my life where I'd just moved towns. I was starting over with no friends because they were all in an old town, and that was what I did to kind of distract myself from the chaos of the situation.
Right.
Uematsu is the reason. I just get lost in these worlds of music, and I became such a fan of him. I've actually met him at a meet and greet.
Wow.
I got on a bus and I was there for 72 hours straight, just one way, so that I could meet him.
What event was it that you traveled to?
Final Fantasy Distant Worlds.
Distant Worlds.
Yeah,
okay, yeah.
Traveling concert of Final Fantasy music. I've been to 2 of them.
Oh, that's awesome. I actually, one of my, probably the closest thing that I can find to relate to the story you just told about you in Final Fantasy is World of Warcraft.
Oh, yeah?
It might not be quite that deep of a connection, but that was one of those worlds that I just, the second I stepped into it, I'm like, this is it. I had been like switching MMOs, trying to find a world that connected with me. That was it.
Yeah.
And Russell Brower is the one who does a lot of the compositions ever since, like maybe the first expansion or what have you.
Yeah, there have been some other composers, but yeah, I'm familiar with the name.
Right. But it's mostly Russell's stuff that I just can't get enough of. And both Brian and I were lucky enough to go to a Video Games Live concert.
Oh, yes, I've been to one, but go on.
And they had a World of Warcraft portion that was dedicated to, that world. And specifically, I think Wrath of the Lich King was new at that point, so they were showing some of the intro sequences. Anyway, all that to say, we were able to see Russell's work there, and it was. I wish I could have met him and been able to shake his hand, but yeah, I know what it's like to follow that kind of that music that speaks right to you. Yeah.
Well, that makes a lot of sense considering your affiliation with OC Remix. You obviously have a very deep passion for game soundtracks.
That is definitely true, especially considering the many podcast episodes we put out before we were even with OC Remix. This is just kind of a recent thing, so it was quite a journey to get here. But anyway, back to your journey. So you played a bunch of Final Fantasy, starting with 4 and the like. It really spoke to you. And when did you start arranging it?
Well, when I was 12, I got, well, it wasn't my first keyboard, but my second keyboard that was really good. And I started composing my own original work, but I was also learning a lot of game songs from Zelda and Final Fantasy and Mario on the piano. And I remember I'd learn little bits and pieces of different songs from Final Fantasy 9 or 6 or whatever, and imagine these concerts where all these songs were connected together, and I just lie in bed at night dreaming of being able to hear a medley of all these things. And then a few years later, I found some composing software, and instead of using composing everything on the piano, I started composing everything digitally. And then I discovered that I could download MIDI from Final Fantasy and other games, and I started playing around with those, switching instruments, adding my own bits in. So it just sort of happened naturally before I really knew what remix was. And then it wasn't long before I started making covers, but I didn't really start making the medleys until, I'd say, 3 years ago.
Okay.
And that's because I started to get software that I felt was good enough to really accurately portray the realism of the orchestra, or at least come closer.
Right. And that's a really tricky thing to do when you have so many instruments, hoping that your sounds, match the grandeur or the emotions that you're trying to capture, especially when it's just you.
Yeah. My first medley was a mix of all the main themes of Final Fantasy. And then I did that with Zelda. I didn't have all the main themes of Zelda, but I had a bunch of them. And then I started doing them for individual games. And it was partly to impress one of my friends I mentioned in the break. She was the one who I played FF6 with recently.
Okay, cool.
Well, I asked her, which Final Fantasy would you want to hear a medley about? And she had to think about it, and she said 1, so I started with 1, and then I did 7 because she was so eager to hear about 7. And then I went to 6 after that, when that one was for me.
Yeah.
And then I went on and did the rest, but 6 was probably the most fun one.
And that's something that I don't think we even mentioned on the show yet. And on Twitter, I was pretty active a few months ago saying how into the Final Fantasy series I've gotten musically. And as I mentioned before, 6 was the one that captured me. So I'm really glad that was the one you were excited to do.
Well, I nearly chose 9, but because you haven't heard it yet, I'd rather...
Yeah, I could follow this a lot more easily. So when you're working with Uematsu's music, what's your take on it? Do you try to follow it sort of note by note, trying to bring to life what you heard when you listened to it, or are you kind of trying to bring your own style into it and give it something new?
It's definitely both. I want to capture the soul or spirit of his work. That's the most important part. I can't lose that. But I also want to inject a lot of newness into it, because that's actually what's necessary to recreate nostalgia. People have to kind of re-spark their interest in, or look at a facet of it they hadn't noticed before but was always there.
Right, that familiarity is key, where I'm listening to one song source fade into another, and I hear, like some background notes or like 2 notes back and forth. I'm like, oh, wait, Locke is coming. Like, I know like that sound, and then I'm ready to accept the rest of it.
That's absolutely what I'm going for, so I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, awesome.
There are parts in the medley too where it's not just capturing individual songs, it's also capturing synergy between songs. One thing, like, at the risk of sounding like I'm bragging, one thing I think I kind of excel at is transitions between pieces. All
right.
And a big part of that is brainstorming. Before I start a medley, I think, okay, what belongs next to what? And sometimes it's musically, sometimes it's story-based. For example, I followed up Forever Rachel with Locke's theme because of his connection to her. And the 2 themes are actually very similar. Locke's theme and Rachel's theme are variations of the same theme.
Right.
And then the ending theme, I had a little slice of that because we're sort of in a section dealing with characters. So the ending theme had a bit of Setzer in there, and a bit of Daryl's tune, which is a variant of his theme. And then it sort of switched to the Edgar and Sabin Figaro part, and then I just went directly to the regular Edgar and Sabin theme, the Figaro Castle theme. And I kind of put that at the end because it's one of the most showy climactic pieces, although it's 22-minute song, you have many climaxes. And then
I know, I was always kind of surprised at how it would just keep flowing like this river of Final Fantasy that just would never end. And then when it ended, I'm like, oh, it's over. Wow, I hadn't even been paying attention to the time at that point. So how did you pick the placement? You mentioned like a bunch of smaller ties to tie them together, but did you sit down and did you pre-plan where all these musical themes are going to be before you even wrote it?
Meticulously, I had to.
Okay.
I had to do a lot of transposing of the key so that things would follow more smoothly. The FF6 soundtrack is actually fairly modular, and by that I mean a lot of the songs are in the same key as one another, or a relative key.
Right.
And there's a lot of songs that are sort of archetypically connected, so they'd flow into one another very smoothly anyway. But there was a lot of tweaking too, of course, tweaking the tempo. Some things would be slowly getting slowed down or sped up, and I actually just kind of sat there and made notes of all the ways I could possibly transition, and a bunch of sort of trees of possible orders that the songs could go in.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
A lot of it is the story I want to tell. That's the most important thing. So, for example, I started with the sound of an orchestra warming up to immediately remind people of the opera and just kind of the fun spirit of the game. And then I went into the opening music to make them feel like they're turning the cartridge on. And I had to think about where I wanted to end it to. I ended it on Terra's theme because it's one of the most important themes in the game, and I knew that people would be missing it all the way through, thinking, oh, where's the overworld theme? Where's Terra's theme? Mm-hmm. So I gave it to them at the end, sort of as a reward for sticking with it. And then at the end of it, I don't know if you noticed this or not from listening to the soundtrack before, but instead of bringing the overworld theme to its conclusion, it has that sort of epic climax in the original. I took it in the direction of the variant of her theme that plays in the opening cutscene, where the Magitech walking in the snow. So it's a lot darker and more sort of Star Wars-y at the end.
I definitely got that vibe, and I think that's one reason why it surprised me so much when it ended, because I was expecting something slightly different. But I like that direction. That's pretty cool.
Well, it ends on a darker note because I feel that the game ends on a darker note. It's that the world is pretty much destroyed. People have died. And they've been through some incredible ordeals. Terra loses her ability to transform. Nothing will ever be the same again. But there's also a sense of hope. So I end with a little bit of the prelude, but the minor chords of the prelude, so that it's kind of like, okay, this is a
little uncertain about the future.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing I absolutely love about the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack.
What's that?
Is that it begins with that Omen song, and I'm always off key, but it's that kind of bum bum bum.
Yeah, I love that bit. Oh.
And then you go through so much of the game, and then right there at the end, when I think it's when you're about to face Kepka or something, that theme comes back, and that is the disaster.
Yeah.
And obviously I haven't played the game, so I'm just like inventing stuff in my own head. But I love that. Man, leitmotif and the thematic just like resonance of this music is like super powerful.
Mm-hmm. The Uematsu soundtracks notoriously have a bunch of central themes, kind of like a Wagner opera or something like that, where you see the same little tunes coming back again and again. There's a bunch of unique ones, but there's variations, and it makes everything feel more cohesive and connected.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
So did you end up experimenting with any new tools or programs or whatnot when you were creating this, or did you kind of use your standards?
Oh, it was all new.
Oh,
If I could go, well, not all, but most of it, if I could go back and do it again, it would sound way better than it does now. Like some of it was video software. The version of this on YouTube is actually lower quality than the one on my Bandcamp.
okay.
But I've learned so much since then. I was new at Ableton, for example. That's my audio workstation. Before I was able to procure an audio workstation, I had to do everything with just a MIDI arranging program and VSTs in that, and I'd have to take digital recordings of everything one at a time and layer them together, and it was so much more limited.
Yeah.
Anyone who's been following my work will probably see a steady progression of quality.
Yeah, I can totally relate with that. I don't make music myself yet, but I do a lot of podcasting, and I've had that same transition.
And you learn the tricks as you go.
Yeah, like if I could do some old shows over... Hold on, my cat's destroying my headphones. Stop it. If I could do some old shows over again, man, I would knock them out of the park and compared to what they sound like now.
I definitely get it. Well, FF6, this medley, I feel holds up better than some of my other ones I did that year. I'm almost embarrassed with FF1 and 7.
Yeah,
other people don't notice as much, but I still do.
Because you're going to pick up on all those things that you want to fix.
Yeah, exactly. I think the 6th one, I almost lucked out. There were a few happy accidents with the producing side of things that worked in my favor, but there were also some parts where I can clearly tell, oh, I should have used a different sample, or oh, I forgot to unfreeze that track when I exported it and I didn't discover until months later, like that kind of thing.
Well, what do you think was the toughest part of it?
The 6 medley?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if I can remember. There's always been problem movements in every. I'd say probably the Magitech Factory and Zozo / Slam Shuffle movements.
Okay.
I'm happy with the arrangements. I wouldn't change them necessarily, but I think they sound significantly lower quality than the rest of it, especially Zozo. There were parts where the percussion sounded not very realistic. And that's because I hadn't really figured out how many instruments I really had in my VST.
I gotcha.
I'm actually planning a Magitech Factory remix just on its own that's going to be really big and epic and almost like an apology for that.
That sounds like a really awesome idea, though. That song is one that gets stuck in my head like nobody's business.
Oh, yeah.
Just goes up and down. You can like hear like the musical machines pounding away. It's cool.
I don't know if you're familiar with my series. I have a series called Final Fantasy: The Psychology and Philosophy. You're probably not familiar with it because you haven't played the series yet, but
no.
I have a section about the music, and I talk about Magitech Factory as an example of the kind of song that gets stuck in your head and is so. Yeah.
Yeah, I better look into that. It'll explain a lot.
It's going to talk a lot about stuff that won't really mean anything to you. It's like character archetypes and that kind of thing. But the music part, you'll definitely be able to relate to.
Okay, cool. And honestly, I plan to go in, and if I don't, I've actually restarted Final Fantasy VI over the past week. Then I got distracted because Rise of the Tomb Raider came out. But I was really enjoying seeing the music in motion. So hopefully I'll get to that point eventually.
Yeah, there's some of that actually. Sometimes you talked about listening to soundtracks without playing a game. So I do that a lot. I've got lots of soundtracks for things I've never even touched, and sometimes I'll see the game weeks or even years later and be so satisfied to see the music where it was placed.
Definitely. Watching that intro cinematic to Final Fantasy VI, I don't care how old the game is, that was mind blowing. It's an amazing scene.
I'd actually go on, you first.
Oh, well, I was going to move on topic, so by all means, continue.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about that intro song, if that's okay, because I think that's one of the highlights of the entire series in terms of music. There are 3 movements to the intro piece, as you probably noticed, but one thing that really got me right after that ramping up scene with the thunder and the escalating notes, it stops on the logo and it plays this really wistful, delicate piece with pianos like do 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 do. You know, that part, and that's what really got me out. That might have been the first video game song that wrenched my soul, so to speak. I heard that and I felt like I was in another world. Something about it just clicked.
I don't think I could put it any better than you just put it, actually, so I'm not going to try, but yeah, it felt like it was about to transport you somewhere in this weird way.
Yeah.
So we kind of talked about the challenging parts of this arrangement. Do you have a favorite part or favorite parts that you wanted to point out?
Oh my, okay, let's see. I'm just going to look at the list here. Right off the bat, though, I wanted to say the Save Them movement, that was fun.
That is one of my favorite songs from the whole album.
It's just so satisfying, right? It rips you in the solar plexus. You just feel like you've eaten a hearty meal.
Yes.
Right? And I love the background sounds at the climax of that. It's like it has this sense of movement, almost like you're galloping on a horse or something like that.
Yeah.
It feels fast, you feel free, you feel active. Even though it plays during a couple parts in the game that might even be considered bleak, because you're literally just going around killing human soldiers. There's nothing sunny or happy about that. But the song makes it feel like you're doing this righteous,
invigorating, exciting
thing.
Yeah, that's nuts. I've listened to that song while driving, and I have to be very cautious with the speed limit. And
right before that, Mystery Train, Kefka, and the Velt movement I was very happy with, because what I did was I took Shadow's theme, which is very similar to Mystery Train, and I continued the melody as though they were the same piece. Few people even notice when it transitions, and that's appropriate because Shadow goes with you onto the train, and both pieces are kind of sketchy and dark sounding. And then in the Mystery Train, I included aspects of Kefka's theme that I found blended perfectly with the train music. And
yeah, was that the portion where you added the Kefka laugh in the background?
That actually,
or was that later?
Yes, I kind of turned it into a little waltz of just Kefka, but using the same instruments I was using on the train. So it sounds like it's part of a train movement, but
yeah,
it's a small Kefka movement. That's where the laugh went. Right.
Right. Oh, that's a good impression.
And then after that, I went to the Velt/Wild West, and I actually continued Kefka's theme in there. You can hear it in the background. It's actually playing three themes at once. It's playing that, the Wild West, and it's also playing the Empire theme, because I found all three of those melodies fit together as though they're the same piece.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's really fascinating to see how you've pieced, you took the whole soundtrack apart and then re-pieced the puzzle together where they fit.
That's a good way of putting it. That's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
My patience for music is pretty much unending after doing these medleys. I've got two Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross ones that are 30 and 31 minutes long.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that must take a lot of patience. So
yeah.
Well, do you have any more remixes kind of in the pipeline? Anything you're working on?
Oh God, so many. I've got 100 different things on my list, and I'm currently working on the Link's Awakening medley.
Oh, cool.
I'll be doing a Secret of Mana one. Twilight Princess will be very soon.
Okay. Oh man, yeah, I love Twilight Princess.
The Magitech Factory one, as I said. I'm also working on Aquatic Ambience from Donkey Kong Country 1.
Oh, good choice.
And,
yeah.
My friend and I are going to do a harp and vocal collab for the Final Fantasy Prelude. So I'm also doing a Deku Palace collaboration with David Ramos. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I haven't. What is his speciality in the music
realm?
Guy.
He does a lot of live game covers and
Oh, neat.
the ocarina really well.
Yeah, the Deku Palace is one of my favorites. That song's nuts.
Yeah, it's great.
Deku nuts, if you will. Haha, it's a little humor for you. That's the kind of trademark overclock podcast humor you're going to get on the show.
That's okay.
I think that pretty much brings us to the end of this interview, Rebecca, but thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, awesome. It was fun.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you've clearly put a ton of thought into this medley, and hopefully I do it justice by editing in the appropriate cues at the appropriate times, but we'll see. Anyway, we will see you around. Thank you again, and we'll bring you back to the show now.
Oh, thanks for having me, Stephen.